path which continued on to the development of hypnosis and psychotherapy, and specific trance-inducing practices to access supernatural abilities, convulsions and spectacular trance responses in patients.
You're amused?
Oh, merely skeptical. How would you go about it?
I've used hypnotism more than once in healing. Not for profit. I'm not a professional. But I do think I could help you. If you'd care to...
I can't think of a pleasanter experience.
Now you will do exactly as I tell you.
In part 2, we'll explore how this refusal to progress his theories was to be his undoing, and how mesmerism developed in the wake of this. Mesmer's approach became known as mesmerism. Although the medical establishment generally felt Mesmer was a charlatan, his dramatic cures and reports of trances that people entered during his magnetic therapy attracted many followers. There were some people who claimed Mesmer was in the same league as faith healers. Others felt the mesmeric trance state was the same trance as occult practitioners entered. Mesmer argued vehemently against this, trying to push what he saw as a scientific theory rather than it being a supernatural theory of what he was doing. As mesmerism increased in popularity, it began to follow two paths: a scientific path which continued on to the development of hypnosis and psychotherapy, and an occult path which maintained its mesmerism roots. And many of the practices have continued even through to present times, with people using specific trance-inducing practices to access supernatural abilities. Unfortunately, with the dramatic image of mesmerism, with practitioners portrayed as controlling and forceful, asserting their will over people, creating convulsions and spectacular trance responses in patients, frequently in whole groups, and its growing use by occult practitioners, the public came to develop uncertainty and fear in the power of mesmerists, or following the debunking of Mesmer's theories, and thus the idea that mesmerism was seen as debunked, they believed that anyone doing mesmerism must be a charlatan. This perspective has carried over from mesmerism into hypnotism to this day. It is common, despite decades of research to the contrary, to encounter people who believe hypnosis is fake. And it is still also common to find people who believe hypnosis is real, but who are scared of it, believe it to be about someone asserting their will over others, with people being powerless to resist, or that it is somehow connected with the occult, with people mistakenly claiming that hypnosis puts you into a trance that lets evil spirits through. In 1784, Benjamin Franklin was called in, and a commission was set up to investigate mesmerism and the claims made about how it worked. The commission concluded that there was no magnetic fluid, that when patients could see what was being magnetized, they experienced some effect, but when they couldn't see what had been magnetized, they experienced no effect. So there can't be any magnetic fluid, because they should have had the same experience, whether they were looking or not. This appeared to discredit Mesmer and claim mesmerism was nonsense, but it didn't address the fact that many people had been cured, and that many people experienced effects. All they had done was prove that Mesmer's theories were incorrect. One of Mesmer's students, the Marquis de Puysegur, didn't get as much recognition or credit as he perhaps should, although his approach was gaining popularity at the time when Mesmer's approach had been discredited. His view was that the power resided within the patient, and that it was more about the patient's belief and their wanting success that led to the mesmeric trance state, and that there were other ways of inducing it rather than through animal magnetism. Perseguer disliked the violent, convulsive reactions of patients during treatment by Mesmer. He felt that it must be possible to keep someone calm during the process. He decided to try this with his next patients. While working with them, when he noticed them starting to get worked up, he diverted their attention to lighter themes as a way of keeping them in a pleasant state during treatment. Perseguer seemed to have a great ability to build a deep rapport with his patients, so they became hyper-responsive to his communication. He shared about a client spontaneously singing songs he was mentally rehearsing in his own mind, or answering questions he had thought but not asked. This was something that about 130 years later, the famous hypnotherapist Milton Erickson was just beginning to explore as a teenager, which he called subliminal auditory stimulation, and used to use therapeutically and for doing hypnosis. Perseguer interpreted it as being a telepathic ability, whereas 130 years later, Erickson recognized that people have greater potential than they realize to pick up on and respond to non-conscious communication. Perseguer felt that the state his patients entered was different to that of Mesmer's patients. He termed this state somnambulism, a state where people appeared to be asleep, yet they had these incredible abilities, like being telepathic. They communicated as if they were wide awake and alert, yet the person communicating often had a different quality to them to the person outside of this state. They also frequently reported amnesia for what was occurring within the somnambulistic state. Not everyone was able to be guided into somnambulism. Some people would just become relaxed and sleepy, but Perseguer's aim was to try to get people into this state. Perseguer's approach became popular as somnambulists sprung up in place of mesmerists, but because of Perseguer's focus on interpreting what he saw in somnambulistic patients as being paranormal abilities, the medical community didn't take his work seriously. Somnambulists used more suggestions towards changes they would want or expect to see made and used by the client. They used to use post-hypnotic suggestions by suggesting things would happen in the future, rather than it being all about what is happening in the session. They would send patients away with suggestions that something will happen, that either they give or they elicit from the patient, like at 7 p.m. on Friday, you'll have a related discharge from your nose, and this problem will clear up. And it seems from reading the literature that there was a lot of discharges in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Then, at the time that the patient would have a discharge, they would find they no longer have their problem. Another mesmerist of the time was Abbe Faria. Faria was a Portuguese priest who took a very different approach to mesmerism than other mesmerists of the early 1800s. He recognized that what was important was expectancy and the patient's cooperation. It wasn't about the mesmerist or about magnetic fluid or willpower against a patient, but about grabbing attention, creating expectancy, engaging cooperation. Faria believed that it was the mesmerist's suggestions and behaviours which led to the development of the mesmeric trance, not animal magnetism. Faria had stage presence to rival Mesmer's. He was more like a stage hypnotist. He would elicit hypnotic phenomena like hallucinations, amnesia, analgesia on stage, as well as other effects you would likely see at a modern hypnosis show. He used a mesmeric gaze to capture and hold attention, as well as giving firm commands. Eventually, an actor attended one of his shows and pretended to respond to his lucid sleep, as Fourier termed it. And then, at the height of the routine, he jumped up and declared he wasn't in the lucid sleep. He had been playing along the whole time. Like Mesmer, Fourier was declared a charlatan, and as such, hasn't become as well known as he deserves. Fourier's approach was probably the closest to what modern-day hypnotists would be familiar with doing. He would start by reciting a script to the subject. The script was described as remarkable for its obscurity. At the end of the script, he would look at the subject and in a commanding voice, he would say the word sleep. If necessary, he would say sleep a few more times. Fourier's approach induced lucid sleep in half his subjects in under 1 minute. For those people that it didn't work with, his next process would be to have the subject gaze at his hand. He would then move his hand close to the face until they closed their eyes and entered the lucid sleep. Then, for those this didn't work for, he would give a light touch on the head, temples, nose, diaphragm, heart, knees, and feet. And for most, this would provoke sufficient concentration. In the 1830s, mesmerism began to spread from Europe into the UK and the USA. Dr. John Elliotson was one of the most respected physicians in London. Elliotson was always on the forefront of testing new techniques and therapies, so when he encountered mesmerism, he began to test this with patients and quickly began to give demonstrations and lectures to large audiences of interested students and visitors. Many of his colleagues were unhappy with his behaviour. The University Medical Committee banned the demonstrating and use of mesmerism from its hospital wards and lecture theatre. Eventually, Elliotson reasserted his authority as a well-respected professor at the university to carry out mesmerism research. Unfortunately, he clung to the theories about animal magnetism, believing that it was far more likely to be based on something tangible like electricity and magnetism than on some mystical notion about the power of the mind. He felt that many of these forces were unseen and yet real and testable, and far more plausible. Unfortunately, this clinging to a theory which had already been discredited didn't help him gain scientific credibility for mesmerism. By the late 1830s, mesmerism had spread through the UK. There were many lay mesmerists espousing its health benefits and making wild and miraculous claims about its effects and what it could treat, at a time when mainstream science had moved on from what was viewed to be a discredited practice. This is still a problem today, that there are lay hypnotists making often miraculous claims about hypnosis, its effects, what it can treat and how it works, with little to no basis on the science. And just like with mesmerism, this negatively impacts on hypnosis developing and maintaining an image of legitimacy. A follower of Elliotson's work and reader of books on the subject of mesmerism was a Scottish surgeon, Dr. James Esdale. While in India during the late 1830s and 1840s, Esdale performed over 3,000 operations with mesmerism as the anaesthesia. At the time, post-operative survival rates of surgery was around 50%. Esdale's patients had a survival rate of around 95%. They also recovered quicker and rarely had post-operative shock. Esdale struggled to gain traction with promoting mesmerism as a useful way of managing pain control and treating problems, despite his high level of success. Part of this struggle was due to doing mesmerism, which had a bad reputation as something charlatans did, and the medical community treated it as a debunked practice. Another issue was that he was doing surgery on poor Indians, and so Indians' upper castes didn't want to see him for surgery, and colonial British didn't want to see him for surgery. The third reason behind the struggles to raise awareness of the benefit of using mesmerism for pain control during operations was that at the same time ether, chloroform and nitrous oxide had come into use. Esdale believed that one of the most important aspects of what he was doing was having a high level of rapport with his patients and conveying his confidence and belief in what he was doing and the success he expected to achieve. In the USA, people like John Dodds was among the first to practice mesmerism. Dodds used a technique of holding a coin or other metal item in front of the subject and having them gaze at it, and they would enter a mesmeric trance. Dodds theorized that the metal was having some influence on the subject, and eventually this was termed electrobiology. It didn't occur to Dodds that patients were entering the mesmeric trance due to having their attention held on the coin, and this narrow focus of attention was what was behind the development of the trance. But it was around this time, at the beginning of the 1840s, that a Scottish surgeon, James Braid, was about to share his ideas and give birth to the name hypnotism. Prior to Braid, people generally viewed mesmerism as either animal magnetism, which had been debunked, or fraud conducted by charlatans. There were a few people who had begun to develop the idea of suggestion and the imagination being involved in what was occurring, but it took Braid to formulate this view.
Next time on Hypnosis in the Media.
Continuing on the story of hypnosis from Braid to modern hypnotism.
Thanks for watching until the end. If you want to see more, just hit the subscribe button.